Constantinople, 1512. A man ascends to the throne of the Ottoman Empire and inherits the most formidable military force the known world has ever seen. He has 8 years left to live. Within those 8 years, he will expand his empire to twice its size, dismantle 2 of the greatest armies the medieval era ever fielded, and enter the holiest cities on earth as their undisputed ruler. Rome needed a century to accomplish what Selim achieved in less than a decade. But here is where the logic breaks down. Selim didn't begin by pointing his sword outward. He started by tearing apart everything nearest to him, his own bloodline, his own court, his own father's legacy. And the question history has never cleanly resolved is this: was that destruction the price of greatness, or was it greatness itself? To understand how a man this ruthless built something this enduring, you first need to understand what he was stepping into before he ever unsheathed a blade. Amasya, around 1470. Selim ibn Bayezid was not born at the center of power. He was born at its edges. Third son. Remote posting. A prince in a system engineered to produce exactly one winner. Ottoman succession had no rules of inheritance, no orderly transfer from father to firstborn. Instead, the empire operated on a brutal, unspoken arrangement. When the sultan dies, his sons fight. The last one standing claims the throne. Selim observed that system throughout his entire childhood. He came to understand it the way a man understands a blade, not as a symbol, but as an instrument. His father, Bayezid II, was a restrained sultan, measured, intellectual, slow to move. Under his reign, Ottoman expansion had stalled, and to the east, something new and threatening was taking shape. The Safavid dynasty under Shah Ismail I was spreading Shia Islam across Iran, its influence bleeding deep into Anatolia like slow-acting venom. Bayezid observed and waited. Selim had no tolerance for waiting, because the stakes were not theoretical. If Safavid influence reached the heart of Anatolia, the Ottoman state would fracture from within before any external enemy ever breached its walls. Failure to act wouldn't just mean losing a war. It would mean losing the empire his grandfather Mehmed the Conqueror had sacrificed everything to build. Picture yourself as Selim in 1511. Your father is aging and indecisive. Your brothers are already positioning for the throne. And on your eastern frontier, your enemy isn't targeting your soldiers. He's targeting your people's beliefs. Selim seized the throne in 1512. His father stepped aside. His brothers were already dead or in flight. Selim had the sword. Now he needed a direction. He pointed it east. He had no way of knowing that east would only be the opening move. Shah Ismail I was not a man you underestimated and walked away from. He had transformed the Safavid state from a religious movement into a military force in fewer than 2 decades. His cavalry, the Qizilbash, weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. They were true believers, men who charged into battle convinced their Shah was divinely sanctioned and that dying for him was a direct transaction with paradise. You cannot reason with that. You can only shatter it. Selim understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime studying how power actually functions, rather than how people like to pretend it functions. He marched his army east in 1514. Hundreds of thousands of men. Artillery trains hauled through mountain corridors in eastern Anatolia. Iron wheels grinding against stone, the sound reverberating across valleys for miles. The Safavids had what the Ottomans lacked: speed, agility, and command of the terrain. But Selim had something Shah Ismail had never encountered at scale: gunpowder. The Ottoman forces carried cannons and firearms in numbers no Eastern army had ever faced. The Qizilbash cavalry charged the way they always charged: fast, fearless, and certain of divine protection. They rode directly into walls of fire. The Battle of Chaldiran, 1514, northwest of present-day Iran. It was over in hours. The Safavid cavalry shattered. Shah Ismail barely escaped with his life. His wives were taken prisoner. Selim walked through the streets of Tabriz, the Safavid capital, as its temporary sovereign. He didn't linger. His commanders pushed him to advance further and eliminate the Safavids entirely. Selim assessed his supply lines, his worn-out troops, and the approaching winter, then made the decision that separates great commanders from reckless ones. He pulled back, but the signal had been sent in a language no one could misread. The eastern flank was sealed. Now Selim faced 2 options: return to Constantinople and consolidate his gains, or pivot south toward an empire so wealthy, so ancient and so deeply woven into the fabric of the Islamic world that even Mehmed the Conqueror had never attempted to touch it. He turned south. That choice would alter everything. The Mamluk Sultanate had governed Egypt, the Levant, and the Hejaz for over 2.5 centuries. They had halted the Mongols. They had driven the Crusaders into the sea. They held custodianship of Mecca and Medina, the most politically influential religious title in the Sunni world. And by 1516, they were hollowed out. The discovery of the Cape of Good Hope had rerouted global trade. Ships that once passed through Mamluk-controlled harbors now sailed around Africa entirely. The tax income that had funded Mamluk armies for generations was drying up. Their sultan, Qansu al-Gawri, was 75 years old. Selim was 46. Northern Syria, August 24, 1516. The plain of Marj Dabik. The Mamluk army assembled in traditional battle formation. The cavalry, the infantry, the classic structures of medieval Islamic warfare that had beaten Crusaders and Mongols alike. But this was no longer the medieval world. The Ottoman artillery opened fire. The concussive sound reached the Mamluk cavalry before the projectiles did. Horses broke ranks. Men who had never faced cannon fire at scale found themselves inside a geometry of destruction they had no counter for. Sultan Qansu al-Gawri died somewhere in the chaos. His heart gave out, or a cannonball found him. The historical accounts diverge on the specifics. What they agree on: the Sultan of the Mamluks died on the field at Marj Dabik. His army dissolved. Selim didn't slow down. Aleppo fell. Damascus fell. Beirut, Gaza, Jerusalem, the entire Levant land that had been fought over, traded, and bled for across 1,000 years, passed into Ottoman hands within weeks. But Egypt still stood. And as long as it did, the Mamluks had a base, a treasury, and a reason to consider a comeback. January 22, 1517. The plain of Radania, outside Cairo. The new Mamluk Sultan, Tumen Bey, had constructed a defensive line, positioning his artillery to face the direction he expected Selim to approach from. Selim came from the other direction. Tumen Bey's cannons were aimed at an army that wasn't there. The Ottoman forces flanked, then collapsed the center. The battle was decided before its full weight could be felt. Cairo fell. The Mamluk Sultanate, 267 years old, ceased to exist on a January morning in 1517. What Selim now controlled was not simply territory on a map. It was the structural backbone of the Islamic world itself. Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, all of Egypt, the Hejaz, Mecca, Medina, the Red Sea ports. The routes traveled each year by millions of pilgrims from every corner of the known world. In 8 years, the Ottoman Empire had grown by roughly 70%. The numbers eventually stopped meaning anything. What matters is what the growth signified. The empire was no longer a regional Balkan and Anatolian power with imperial ambitions. It had become the gravitational center of the entire Muslim world. Then came something no Ottoman sultan had ever held before. Something that couldn't be seized by force, only transferred through consent. The last Abbasid Caliph resided in Cairo, a ceremonial remnant of a title stretching back to the 7th century. In the aftermath of Cairo's fall, the Caliph stood before Selim and transferred the banner, the sword, the relics of the Prophet, the Caliphate itself. The most politically and spiritually weighted title in Islam passed from the Abbasid lineage into Ottoman hands. Istanbul, a city that had been Christian Constantinople fewer than 70 years earlier, was now the capital of the Islamic Caliphate. Military empires collapse when their armies stop winning. But religious legitimacy, the kind that frames your enemies as not merely defeated, but spiritually wrong for opposing you, outlasts armies. It outlasts dynasties. It outlasts the man who constructed it. Selim built both in 8 years. And then, with the particular cruelty history sometimes delivers, he died. September 22, 1520. He was approximately 50 years old, still planning his next campaign when his body gave out. His commanders said he wept when he realized he would not see it through. Not from fear, but from the specific grief of a man who can see exactly where he is headed and understands he will not arrive. What he left behind was a transformed world. His son Suleiman, whom history would name the Magnificent, inherited an empire so fundamentally different from what his grandfather had ruled that governing it required an entirely new strategic imagination. The caliphate title remained with Ottoman sultans for 4 more centuries, until the modern Turkish Republic dissolved it in 1924. 400 years of legitimacy, built on 8 years of conquest. The real question was never whether Selim the Grim was great. The darker question is this: is it possible to build something truly permanent without becoming the kind of person you would have feared when you were young? Selim never answered that. He just kept building.